Yeah. Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon for those of you joining us live on Facebook. And likewise to those of you in 1 second who will be joining us live on YouTube, or vice versa. We're on YouTube and now Facebook Live. This is Parsha Talk. This week is Parsha Wahi. Israeli politics are so messed up, but thank God it's raining, so God isn't too upset at us. And for those of you who have been following the news about the Haggadah, we have already printed a few copies. I've been looking them over. We've caught some typos. We've caught a few things that change, a little bit of color issues. And God willing, starting Sunday, we'll be printing them en masse. And we'll have, Baruch Hashem, thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of copies available for sale. And for those of you who have been generous enough to donate toward the cause, thank you very much for helping the dream come true. And I bless everybody that they merit to use their Haggadahs this year and every subsequent year, God willing. The title here we have is What Did Pharaoh say? What did Jacob say to Pharaoh? That was actually from last week's parsha. We have, as I noted in years past, that final section in what we know as Parashat Vayigash details a stark contrast between how the Hebrews in Egypt weathered the storm that was the years of famine, and how the native Egyptians did. How the Hebrews were immigrants and they received a parcel of land that was all to their own and good for what they needed, and they basically became the masters of that place. They were the foreigners. They wanted Goshen. They got Goshen. It was good for their flocks. And also, they were taken care of. The lechem lefi hataf means they got bread, actually food, in accordance with their children, the number of their children, and they were taken care of. Whereas after we read about the brothers and Jacob's encounter with Pharaoh, we see that the Egyptians had it the other way around. The Egyptians had to give up everything they owned and their freedom and their land and anything, and also the Canaanites, in order to obtain food from Pharaoh. And Joseph, as part of this program, basically moved everybody around. He took the native Egyptians from off of their lands and moved them into cities. Basically, no one ended up living on his own, what used to be his own property, and no one ended up living on any property because it was all owned by Pharaoh, except for the clerics who got to control their land and also were provided for by Pharaoh. So this is the stark contrast. That was what we discussed years past. In the middle, we have an encounter between Joseph's family and Pharaoh. We don't know which Pharaoh this was. We're just going to call him Pharaoh. And it's Joseph actually tells his brothers what to say. And he's not even going to bring all his brothers. He's going to bring some. It says from the edges, literally, miktsei achav, different interpretations, what that actually means. Was it even 5 of his actual brothers or 5 of his kinsmen, perhaps nephews? That is unclear. But just 5 of them. And he instructed them just to say that they're shepherds and that's what they've been doing. And his hope was that Pharaoh would just let them settle in Goshen and be done with them. And that is what they told Pharaoh. And Pharaoh agreed. But then Pharaoh actually let Joseph know of his intentions. He was looking for people to employ, and you could make this make sense because Joseph was Pharaoh's best employee. Like he told his other advisors, his top men, have you met someone like this who's as understanding and has God-given wisdom and deserving of all these promotions? He went from being the minister of the economy and the chief of staff to being the minister of defense and then viceroy of Egypt. I'm using modern terms for what exactly Joseph did in Pharaoh's court. And perhaps he was also wondering, maybe if Joseph is so outstanding, amidst tayin, like we would say in Hebrew, perhaps Joseph's brothers were also capable men worthy of, or capable men who, for him at least, it was worth to employ in the government. And Pharaoh was sort of disappointed, I guess, because he told Joseph, if you know of men, I'll put them in charge of what I have. And just giving them a job like that, obviously, would also, if they could show that they were as excellent as Joseph was, they would also be promoted. Of course, like we discussed also in years past, Joseph was basically in a golden cage here in Egypt. He went from being a slave to Potiphar to being a slave to Pharaoh. He couldn't exactly leave his job. So this got the brothers off the hook. But then Jacob had to go meet Pharaoh. And Joseph did not dictate to his father what to say to Pharaoh. Now, considering what Pharaoh wanted, says that when Pharaoh and his advisors heard that Joseph's brothers had first come to Egypt, it says, and the matter found favor, or was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and his servants. That is, they realized, oh, Joseph is here. He's good for us. Bringing in a few more of Joseph. The apple doesn't far fall from the tree from which fell other similar apples. This could be to our benefit. And you would reasonably believe that Pharaoh wanted to know who raised Joseph. How did this come about? What is a source? What kind of upbringing did Joseph have? What kind of education did he have? And that is why Pharaoh would want to meet with Jacob. And it says that, as Rashi points out, and introduces it, Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and taking leave, he blessed Pharaoh again. And in Hebrew, that is one verb. It says Vayvarech. And Rashi points out the first time it means greeting, and the second time it actually means what you and I would call a blessing. So he takes leave of the king, and he gave him an actual blessing. And Chazal even said what that blessing was specifically. Now, you can also assume that Pharaoh asked Jacob himself what exactly his profession was, just like he had asked Joseph's brothers. And Jacob wasn't instructed to call himself a shepherd, but he might have said just properly that it was his main so-called profession, even though he was very, very wealthy. Already for hundreds of years, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were wealthy landowners with owners of many flocks and thousands of followers and servants, and capable of mustering armies and fighting against other kings and making peace with other kings. They were great men, leaders of men, and owners of much land. So Jacob wasn't your run-of-the-mill shepherd, but he probably had to answer to Pharaoh, well, I am Jacob, the son of Isaac and Abraham, and I believe in the one true God. I am from Eretz Canaan because I believe that is where we belong. That is the land I've been promised by God. And we thank you for your hospitality. And Pharaoh would have asked questions, well, what is this beliefs that you teach? Because Joseph himself was very keen to follow his traditions and had some sort of education. And we know that education of the next generation is what made Abraham stand out. That's what God himself said about Abraham. Abraham is going to instruct his children afterwards. And Jacob, as did Abraham and Isaac, told Pharaoh that he does believe in one God, and that God does require moral and ethical behavior and a code of compassion, kindness, and modesty. And he might have even told him about their traditions that he learned from Shem and Aver. He has a tradition that goes back to the creation of the world in Adam. And that is what Pharaoh was then asking. How old are you? Now, it's important. Rav Hirsch's Perush in this point has to be mentioned. Jacob's response was that he's only 130 years, and his days have been few and evil, or few and very bad, and they did not reach the years of his forefathers or his actual fathers. And this is kind of weird because it seems that Jacob is actually complaining about how hard a life he's had. And that's not how Rav Hirsch sees it, because first of all, Jacob's not one to necessarily just complain. How old are you? I'm 130, and life has been really tough. Certainly in front of a foreign king, that's not the way to respond. Rav Hirsch was saying that Jacob was actually being self-critical. And the clue to this is the fact that he says, my days did not reach those of my fathers. He wasn't talking about how bad things were. He was actually criticizing himself. He was saying, I am only 130 years old. I have not lived as long as Abraham, who lived 175, nor Isaac, who lived to be 130, 180, who accomplished much. Jacob was saying he did not accomplish as much in his short life as his fathers. He was holding himself to his father's standards. And he was trying to say that, if you are impressed, Pharaoh, by a person like me, you should have seen Jacob, you should have seen Isaac and Abraham. They were even greater. They lived longer and they accomplished much more. I wish I could have done like they did. That was what Jacob was saying. I'm not as excellent as my father and my grandfather. But more than that, the fact is that Jacob is telling Pharaoh something. He's answering a question that many people who are distant from Judaism, even Jews who are distant from Judaism, do not understand in the book of Genesis. And that is, the beginning of the book has an account of how people used to live for very long. Certain people did. And the way I understand it is that indeed people did live for centuries, but only certain people who had a certain gift. The Rabbi Ari Kaplan, not have time to go into this, but he pointed out that that Adam lived among what you and I would call prehistoric men who had short lifespans, and Adam was different, and he had to keep now we know his genes stable. He had to sort of inbreed, for lack of a better option, in order to keep these very fit genetic capabilities and characteristics that he was given by God. And one of those is lifespans. And as people had to breed out more and more, the lifespans decreased. People read the Genesis and they cannot believe that Terach lived to be more than 200 years old, or that Abraham and Isaac lived close to 200 years, or that even Jacob himself lived almost 150 years. These things seem too fantastic. And that is part of what Pharaoh would ask. Are you saying, how old are you? You're really telling me this? You're 130. 130 is 10 years beyond what is conceivable for the oldest possible people, even today. The oldest people in the Guinness Book of World Records don't make it past 120. And Jacob's saying, 130, you should have seen my fathers. They lived much longer than me by a number of decades, and I don't think I have much more time left on me. So that is what Jacob is answering. He's saying, yes, we have this tradition. We knew that Noah lived to be 950 years old, and Shem and Aver lived also for centuries. That is a fact. And I am a relic. I am the direct descendant of these people, and I carry this tradition and this capability of having such a long lifespan. So to review, Jacob was not complaining, as our first points out. He was just being self-critical. And Jacob was also answering what Pharaoh would have likely asked a person of his caliber. He was asking him how he could have raised Joseph and what he believed in, basically, where he come from and what he does. And that is why the conversation picks up, where Pharaoh asks him, how old are you? That's the clue to the conversation that happened before that. Once again, I'd ask those of our viewers back at home, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for supporting the Agadah once again. And don't forget, send your questions, comments, or questions, comments, criticisms, anything else that starts with a K. And have a Shabbat Shalom.